Skills Coalition. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar overviewing 2015 state legislation. Next slide, please. First, I'd like to begin with a few words about the National Skills Coalition. We seek an America that grows its economy by investing in its people, so that every worker in every industry has the skills to compete and prosper. We organize broad-based coalitions seeking to raise the skills of America's workers across a range of industries. We advocate for public policies that invest in what works, as informed by our members' real-world expertise. And we communicate these goals to an American public seeking a vision for a strong U.S. economy that allows everyone to be part of its success. For today's webinar, I'll be serving as moderator. Presenting will be Brooke DeRenzis, the Senior State Policy Analyst at National Skills Coalition, who will be providing an overview of state legislation enacted in 2015. Elizabeth Creamer, the Advisor for Workforce Development with the Virginia Secretary of Commerce and Trade and the Office of Governor Terry McAuliffe. And Andrea Fursten, the Director of Education and Jobs with the Greater Twin Cities United Way in Minneapolis. Following their presentations, there will be time to ask questions of today's speakers. Also, it should be noted that today's webinar is accompanied by a paper available on our website that provides additional information on the state legislation discussed today, including links to the new state statutes. So with that introduction, I'd like to now turn it over to Brooke DeRenzis.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks to everyone for joining our webinar today. As Brian noted, I'm going to provide an overview of legislation that's been enacted by numerous states in the 2015 session to address the needs of workers and employers. In my review of state skills legislation, I really came across three major themes. States passed laws that were focused on implementing the Federal Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA. They passed legislation focused on expanding career pathways or particular policies that are critical to career pathways, and they took actions to make training more job-driven. So I'm going to organize my presentation according to these three themes. Let's start with WIOA implementation. Next slide, please. So in anticipation of WIOA's effective date of July 1st, 2015, numerous states took action to adopt legislation to implement the new law. And one of the key features of WIOA that many states are currently in the process of working on are state workforce plans. These plans are supposed to describe the vision of the state's workforce development system, the key strategies that states are going to use to support that vision, and how various programs, both federal and state, are going to be working together to carry out those strategies. And here at National Skills Coalition, we've been focused on the state planning process as a real opportunity for states to describe the workforce system they want and to describe how they're going to partner with a variety of education, training, and human service programs to achieve the workforce system they want. So under WIOA, states can submit one of two types of state plans. They can submit unified plans, which include WIOA's core programs, or they can submit combined plans, which include one or more federal programs in addition to WIOA's core programs. Given the focus on state planning throughout states in the country right now, I thought it might be useful to note that some states passed legislation providing direction on the type of state plan to be submitted under WIOA. So for example, Arkansas passed legislation requiring the governor to submit a unified state plan. And while that law doesn't require a broader combined state plan, the law does include additional federal programs that must be one-stop partners in Arkansas's implementation of WIOA. It also establishes a TANF standing committee as part of the workforce board. And so that law really sets a framework for thinking broadly about WIOA implementation. Another example is Louisiana, which passed legislation that requires the state workforce board to develop and submit a combined state plan to the governor. While the legislation requires a combined state plan, it does not specify what additional federal programs must be part of the plan. So those are just two examples of state legislation passed that specifies state plan types under WIOA. Next slide, please. So in addition to specifying state plan types, some states are using WIOA implementing legislation as an opportunity to emphasize key skill strategies that are called out in the new federal law. Legislation in California and Florida underscored sector partnerships and career pathways as key components of WIOA planning and implementation in those states. And as we're going to hear from Elizabeth later, Virginia has passed legislation that's going to advance credential attainment, sector strategies, career pathways, and cross-program data as part of WIOA implementation in that state. Next slide, please. So the second category or theme that I saw in 2015 state legislation was around career pathways. And just to make sure we're all on the same page with terminology, career pathways combine education, training, career counseling, and support services that are aligned with industry skill needs. And career pathways are designed to help participants earn secondary school diplomas or their equivalent, post-secondary credentials, and to help individuals get middle skill jobs. It's also important with career pathways that they be informed by cross-program data that shows how various programs work together to serve students who have different needs. And in 2015, as you can see bulleted here, Colorado and Minnesota both enacted legislation that's going to increase their investments in career pathway approaches. Colorado's House Bill 1274 requires the State Workforce Board to design career pathways in the fields of construction, information technology, and healthcare. And interestingly, that legislation specifically requires sector partnerships, which have a strong presence in many areas of Colorado, to provide input on career pathways that are developed under the legislation to ensure that those pathways are industry-driven. As we're going to hear from Andrea later in the webinar, Minnesota also passed legislation that's going to effectively increase funding for career pathways. And this legislation also expands the state's outcome report card so that the state has better data on outcomes and costs across programs. Next slide, please. So adult education was one of the critical components of a career pathways approach, and adult education in a career pathways approach is typically offered concurrently with or in the same context as general workforce preparation or training for occupations. And there are several states who took actions on expanding adult education in 2015. You can see bulleted here on the slides that Arkansas, California, and Ohio all passed legislation to invest in adult education that's being offered in alignment with job training. Meanwhile, Georgia, which is bulleted here, passed legislation creating a tax credit for businesses who provide or sponsor adult basic skills education programs for employees. So that's really focused on the upskilling of incumbent workers. Next slide, please. So the final piece of career pathways that I want to focus on in today's presentation is around tuition assistance. And we all know that tuition assistance is critical to ensuring that career pathways lead to post-secondary credentials, particularly for part-time students or working students who may have limited access to federal financial aid. So this slide here lists 3 different approaches around tuition assistance that were taken by 3 different states. Indiana's Senate Bill 509 transformed the state's existing part-time student grant into a grant for adult students by requiring eligible students to be financially independent from their parents. Nebraska used legislation to create a community college gap assistance program, and that program will essentially provide funding to community colleges so that they can award financial assistance to lower income residents who are enrolled in non-credit job-driven programs that lead to a post-secondary credential in an in-demand occupation. And then finally, through Senate Bill 81, Oregon has been called the second state to offer free community college next to Tennessee. This bill, Senate Bill 81, will provide eligible students with grants to cover the remainder of their tuition that's not paid for by state and federal aid grants when they attend community college. Next slide, please. So the third category that I want to focus on today is around job-driven training. When we say job-driven training, we essentially mean training that prepares workers for in-demand jobs that exist in a region's economy and training that's shaped by the needs of employers. Now, there's a variety of different policy tools that states can use to advance job-driven training. Some examples might include apprenticeship programs, on-the-job training, and other forms of work-based learning. And in 2015, as you can see on the slide here, California, Colorado, and Washington State all enacted legislation aimed at expanding work-based learning. So California did this by increasing funding for its apprenticeship programs by $29 million. About half of this amount is allocated to existing apprenticeship programs, and the other half is supposed to be used to create new apprenticeship training in high-growth areas. Colorado used legislation to create the industry's workforce development partnership, which is supposed to reimburse businesses for a portion of expenses that are related to paid internships in key industries. And interns can include students from secondary and post-secondary schools, students from adult education programs, as well as recent graduates. And finally, Washington Senate Bill 5863 aims to make apprenticeships more accessible. It does this by requiring its Department of Transportation to spend funds on apprenticeship preparation and support services, and it also requires the department to actively engage communities that are underrepresented in transportation apprenticeships. Next slide, please. So in addition to work-based learning experiences and opportunities, states can also advance job-driven training by using industry-specific advisory councils to make sure that they're investing in jobs that exist in the economy. In 2015, as you see on the slide here, both Hawaii and Oklahoma passed legislation aimed at making healthcare training more job-driven by establishing bodies to advise the state on healthcare workforce policy. Next slide, please. And then the final category I'm going to focus on in regard to job-driven training is training programs that are directly informed by employer input. In 2015, Arkansas passed a bill that creates planning and implementation grants to support job-driven training, and it requires proposals to be submitted by alliances of education and training partners with input from local workforce boards. Maine also passed legislation to establish the Put Maine to Work program that creates employer-driven job training programs in high-demand fields at community colleges. So with that, that's the overview of some of the legislation that's occurred during 2015 sessions in the states. I hope it's given you all a sense of the breadth of policies that states have adopted to close their skill gaps. And I'm going to turn it back to Brian so that we can hear in more detail about policies in 2 states.
Thank you, Brooke, for that overview. We're now going to turn the webinar to focus on Virginia and Elizabeth Creamer.
Thank you, Brian. In Virginia, can I have the slide forwarded? Virginia, it's a pleasure to be here representing Governor McAuliffe, and I'm very indebted to Brian for asking me to participate. Among other benefits of this webinar for me, I have the opportunity to get a summary of legislation that's all relevant to where the Commonwealth of Virginia is moving, so it's a treat and an honor. When Governor McAuliffe assumed office in January 2014, the immediate workforce challenge that he faced was that Virginia will need 1.4 million new and replacement workers over the next 10 years as the baby boomers retire and STEM-related jobs continue to grow in the state. We have data that shows that about 50 to 65% of those jobs are specialized skills and technical jobs, technician, technologist, trades level, the so-called middle skills jobs that we talk about so much in workforce development circles. And there really was not a concerted state strategy to address that skills gap. So that became our #1 strategy. How were we going to address the skills gap in middle skills jobs? This was important because it pinged on all of the principles that this administration thought were important in workforce development, jobs creation, business-driven system, but also making sure that Virginians have an opportunity to access middle-class lifestyle. So we did some research, and we put together a platform whereby we were going to promote what we call credentials to compete. And these are industry certifications, licenses, occupational licenses, registered apprenticeships, and post-secondary education certificates, for the most part, sub-degree credentials that we could begin to track and report both short-term job placements, but also that we could begin to track through our longitudinal data system and other resources. And we wanted to make sure that these credentials would, in fact, get Virginians to middle-class wages. Next slide, please. What we had working for us, and in some ways against us, is Virginia has a large and complex workforce system. Due to previous legislation, what we call our workforce system and what our state workforce board is responsible for, to some extent, is 24 publicly funded programs under 8 state agencies, serving more than 1 million Virginians. Runs the gamut from Perkins to all of the WIOA titles to a diverse and significant array of state-funded programs such as registered apprenticeship and grants for businesses to expand and other programs. So we have a pretty robust array of state and regional sector strategies, and we do have an annual report card that attempts to provide a snapshot of how we're progressing. What we needed was a challenge that would pull all of these diverse agencies under 4 different secretariats together, a common cause, and these credentials to compete is just that cause. So the credentials to compete became the subject of an executive order. You can go to the next slide, as well as the subject of governor summits, numerous speeches by the governor and his cabinet, op-eds and editorials and articles. It's become, we are now in the process of issuing an RFP for a statewide marketing campaign, primarily to young people around these credentials. What we liked was that though the immediate drive was to get Virginians work and to get businesses the workforce they need, a secondary benefit was that it's given that common purpose and a common goal for all 23 programs and 15 workforce development boards in Virginia. The governor issued an executive order where he set a benchmark for the entire system, 50,000 more of these credentials to compete during his administration. That was followed by a very large public event at which, the Virginia Business Higher Education Commission, the Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the Council for Virginia's Future, as well as the governor, stood up and announced that by 2030, we would be looking for 462,000 of these workforce credentials. One significant aspect of that event and that benchmark is that Virginia had since 2012 a benchmark for degree attainment, but the same August persons who had come up with that degree attainment benchmark, now we're talking about needing to also make sure we had a state goal for these workforce credentials. So it's really become our signature initiative. Next slide. In support of that, for 2015, we moved forward with a pretty robust policy and budget to support credentials to compete. We did other things as well, but I wanted to focus on this one signature item. And I will tell you that this will also be our anchor for our 2016 policy and budget agenda, which we're working on now. There were many things. We moved forward several bills that were pretty big. And we, too, as with some of the other states, did put into legislation, we called for a combined state plan. But we also did not name all of the partners as that will evolve. But our primary purpose in the legislation we moved forward was to do 2 things. One, to really try to drive initiatives that would produce more of these workforce credentials, and related to that, redirect funds and organize differently to accommodate, to free more money for this Credentials to Compete drive and campaign. So we were all about repurposing, redirecting funds, creating incentives to credential attainment, creating initiatives that would spur credential attainment, and making sure that we had both business engagement in this process and data to support the decisions we were making and advise us along the way. So we had legislation that redirected $4.5 million in workforce funds. We had some administrative changes that freed more funds for training by, collapsing programs that had previously been under 2 agencies under 1 agency. That kind of rather arduous work, never pain-free, but sometimes important. We established a new incentive program for workforce regions so that they would receive rewards, more funds if they achieved state issued credential attainment benchmarks. We also thought it's very important when you have so many agencies and secretaries involved in your workforce system. We moved forward legislation to create statewide performance measures that exceed the WIOA required partners. And actually, the National Skills Coalition is going to be working with our state to move forward on that work. We also required workforce regions to convene stakeholders. They're now required to show how either the workforce development boards themselves or a designee with whom they have an MOU in place, how are they convening public and private partners to share resources to drive sector strategies, career pathways, and especially these credentials to compete. So that was part of the legislation. We also had legislation that targeted specific populations and trying to generate increased credential attainment for specific populations like veterans. And some early successes of all of this, these executive orders and legislation have been outcomes such as, placing 7,000 veterans in middle skills and above jobs in Virginia. Next slide. We established Virginia's first financial aid program for non-credit training. Only $1 million, but it's the first time that a student with financial need can actually take a non-credit course at a community college to obtain a shorter-term industry certification that can get that student into the workforce, such as welding or CNC machining or more. We required community colleges to set up policies to articulate for college credit some non-credit training, and there will be an expansion of that initial legislation so that eventually I think we'll see policies in place for veterans and to award credit for industry certifications, et cetera. We set up a new competitive grant program to award state funds to business-led consortia. The caveat is that we will provide businesses with needs with state funding for the first time for pre-employment or incumbent worker training or for workforce pipeline development, but the caveat is that the business consortia or the individual business has to match dollar for dollar what the state invests in the initiative. And these are now being run as competitive grants to business, working with public workforce partners or public or private educational institutions. Legislation included a call for the governor's chief workforce advisor to run statewide marketing and public relations around workforce development and these credentials to compete. And what most pleases me, given that we live in a state where there is a one-term governor, a governor cannot succeed himself, we've managed to get credentials to compete into the multi-year strategic plan for both Virginia's community college system, which is not just our largest training provider, but also the state administrator for WIOA Title I programs and the state's primary workforce development agency. So that is very important to sustainability of this initiative and to impact. And these credentials are also a part of the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia's multi-year strategic plan. Both of these plans were just developed and released this year since the Governor's Executive Order 23. And that is a plan, the SHEP plan, or Higher Education Plan, is a plan that has applicability both to community colleges and to public and private universities. So, you know, that's really institutionalizing the work in a way that's very important. Next slide. And that's it for me, and I think I'm right at my time. We continue to look in 2016 for opportunities, legislative, budget, and programming to expand and continue the work.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Elizabeth has been a leader in state government in Virginia on workforce issues for a number of years, and I think everyone can see that quite a bit has been accomplished there. We're going to now have a presentation from the perspective of a state advocate, someone who works outside of state government to try to persuade state policymakers to make advances in workforce development policy. I'm going to turn it over now to Andrea Fursten.
Thank you, Brian, for the introduction and for this opportunity. I'm here talking about the work of MSP WIN in Minnesota, and MSP WIN is a group of funders and workforce advocates that are collaborating to transform Minnesota's workforce system with strategies that not only move low-wage workers and people of color into the workforce, but ultimately help them advance in their careers. You can see here our mission to dramatically increase the number of adults earning family-sustaining wages, especially people of color. Just to give you some context on our region that have informed that mission and vision, between now and 2022, Minnesota employers are expected to have more than 630,000 job openings, but much like the rest of the country, we don't have enough skilled workers in the state to meet that demand. We've got a talent shortage combined with a skills gap and mismatch. But what's somewhat exacerbated in Minnesota compared to other parts of the region is the severity of our racial and economic education and employment disparities, which are some of the worst in the country. In terms of how we frame our work and embark on it from a public policy standpoint, we really think about this as both a moral and an economic imperative. We're fortunate here to have many business leaders who've come together around this issue. They reference a report that shows that if people of color in the metro region were employed at the same rate as white non-Hispanic population by 2040, we would experience a 5% increase in regional employment with more than 120,000 adults joining the paid workforce. Personal income from these workers would add more than $5 billion to the economy, an additional $500 million in state and local tax dollars for reinvestment in our communities. So it's really that frame, that business case that we're really able to bring forward as we're meeting with different stakeholders. Next slide. This just speaks to the breadth of funders that have come together under the umbrella of MSP WIN to drive this work. Not all of them are engaged in the advocacy work, but they all have informed and shaped our agenda as you'll see in the next slide. So the next slide just lays out our public policy strategies over the course of the next few years that fall under our goal of increasing the number of adults earning family-sustaining wages. We really began last biennium in terms of really looking at establishing that standardized outcome reporting for workforce programs and ensuring that we also were able to continue the net impact analysis that we had at here in Minnesota so that we could better understand what was working and for whom, and looking at things like wages before entering a program compared to wages after exiting a program, better understanding the return on that investment we were making so that ultimately we could use that information both with legislators and even amongst philanthropy to just make better decisions in our investments, both for low-income adults in our community and also for employers in our community. As we began to look at what the evidence told us nationally, we really landed on two other key strategies, and one was really around industry-led sector partnerships. This is something that we want to look at more intentionally moving forward into the next session as to how we can leverage and align with WIOA implementation in our state from that perspective. And then the final strategy, we've been fortunate in Minnesota to be part of the Joyce Foundation's initial Shifting Gears initiative, where we were able to develop and launch Minnesota Fast Track for our Adult Career Pathways program. And back in the last biennium, we were able to secure $3 million to support Fast Track programming in Minnesota. And then, as you'll hear in our current session, we were able to expand that funding. Next slide. So as we look at the 2015 session, there were really a few key accomplishments that we focused on with MSP WIN, and that was working very closely with the state and advocating for this realignment. We landed on $11.2 million in realigned funding to support career pathways for low-income adults. We anticipate that this will help around 4,500 adults both secure credential employment that will put them on that career path to more sustaining wages. And then we wanted to continue to build on our work in terms of the standardized outcome report card. So now, in addition to the programs that were included last biennium, we were able to add adult basic education and MFIT programs to that, as well as participant cost data. So that's another level of analysis that we'll have. And then also how we can really bring forward that analysis in ways that are understood and digestible to legislators in future years. Another accomplishment was adding career pathway programs to the net impact report. We want to make sure that that analysis is there as well, so that as we look at sustaining funding and potentially expanding funding for that work, that we have that business case for doing that. And then our third area of focus was on the higher education performance. So we in Minnesota, like the rest of the country, really struggle in terms of really assessing the impact that we're having with our developmental education programs. And so we advocated that our state college and university system report remediation outcomes beginning in 2018. In addition to that, there is legislation that was passed that will require our state college and university system to submit a student performance improvement strategies to the legislature next year that will include such things as co-requisite remediation strategies, meta majors, intrusive advising, other strategies that they believe will be game changers in terms of getting better results for students. And then lastly, I just want to add what's not on the slide is we were also fortunate to have leadership in the Senate and a number of community partners, including MSP WIN, that helped pass legislation to establish a post-secondary completion goal. So we believe this will be another key driver in terms of moving the types of changes that we need in Minnesota to get better results for our community and for our low-income individuals in particular. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. So we are now going to turn to the question and answer portion of the webinar. Please feel free to type in your questions and we'll do our best to respond to them. There will be some questions that are very of a particular nature that we will respond to offline. One of the questions we received, I'll take, and then I'll refer a question to our panelists. One question was whether or not we're aware of any state legislation this year that targeted support for the long-term unemployed. And the answer to that is no. We're not aware of any legislation specific to the long-term unemployed this year. This had been a topic of attention in recent years, of course, with the Great Recession. Our legislative roundup report that was published about a year ago does include some legislation that was enacted in 2014 to support the long-term unemployed, but no, this was not a focus during the 2015 session. Another question that I'm going to pass on this question to our panelists is around career pathways. Folks would like us to expand more, appreciate if you would expand more as to what you mean by career pathways. Brooke provided a brief definition. I'd like to begin with Brooke and have her talk more about what are some of the component pieces of career pathways. And then I would like for Elizabeth and then Andrea to talk about what they mean by career pathways in their state. So Brooke, if you would talk a little more about what we mean by career pathways.
Sure. So going back to the definition I offered, there are just some key components of career pathway approaches that can be supported by policies at the state level. And these include, essentially programmatic approaches that bring together multiple programs to combine adult basic skills education with occupational training, with career counseling and support services in a way that's aligned with the occupations that are in demand from particular industries. And so I talked a little about more comprehensive approaches taken by Minnesota, and Andrea talked about that as well, to put together programs that cover all of those components. I also talked about particular policies that support just one of those components. So for example, adult education that's aligned with job training, and some of the policies that were passed in states like Arkansas, California, and Ohio to do that support one particular component of a broader career pathways approach. Similarly, under support services, we include things like access to child care and transportation, but also access to tuition assistance and financial aid. And so I talked about policies in Indiana and Nebraska and Oregon that are being used to support tuition assistance so that individuals can access and succeed in post-secondary education from a financial perspective. Overall, career pathways are available to workers with different skill levels, and so there's multiple exit points and entry points depending on where a worker is in their education and training continuum. But having the starting place being with adult education and basic skills, particularly for lower skilled individuals, is an important component of an overall career pathways approach, and one of the reasons that we focus on adult education as part of career pathways. I'm not sure if Andrea or Elizabeth, if either of you would like to talk specifically about the career pathway approaches in your states.
I'm happy to step in. This is Andrea from Minnesota. We've got 4 required components very much aligned with what you touched on, Brooke, around career navigation, bridge programming, enhanced academic instruction, and employment and retention, delivered through a collaboration of partners and in a manner appropriate for the needs and circumstances of the participants. I also sent, at least I think I did, on the chat, a link to our state's RFP, the Pathways to Prosperity RFP, that gets into more specific language that might be helpful to other states as well.
And this is Elizabeth. I would I'm going to say ditto to both the previous panelists' comments. In terms of Virginia also has a career pathways definition. We were, I believe, the first state to create a multi-year statewide plan for career pathways and defined it. In practice, most of our pathways are targeted to either low-skill, low-wage adults or to young people who were seeking to move more successfully through the, a more traditional career and technical education pathway into post-secondary education. But we've had great success with statewide models that have career pathway principles built into them, plugged in Virginia, for instance, which serves adults who lack a high school equivalency and provides expedited integrated training that brings together GED preparation with occupational training, employability, skills development, a career readiness certificate, employer engagement and mentorship, and a guaranteed interview with an employer, regional employer in a high demand field at the end. That's kind of symptomatic of what we're trying to do with career pathways, and we're expanding that to other populations with barriers to employment like SNAP-ET clients as well.
Thank you. Building on the topic of employer engagement and now turning to employer engagement in the policy process, could you talk a little bit, both from your experiences in Minnesota and Virginia, about employer support, employer engagement, as you have worked to enact new workforce development legislation in your states? Let's begin with Elizabeth.
Well, firstly, I'm getting backwards now. It's better. I think it's important that we had several years of legislation that really revised our state workforce board, the Virginia Board of Workforce Development. Obviously every state has a state workforce board. Every state has a business-driven workforce board. But we tried to expand well before WIOA. We tried to expand the scope of inquiry and authority of the board to encompass, for instance, secondary and post-secondary career and technical education, so that we would really position business and industry to have the full arsenal of tools at the Commonwealth's disposal to address the skills gap. Because we are taking policy to the board, for instance, in August, next month we'll have our first policy review, and we're actively using that board to inform and suggest policy. That I think has sharpened our our business engagement in terms of policy. We always are reaching out to major professional associations, Virginia Manufacturers Association, the Virginia Energy Workforce Consortium, et cetera. But I would say we've just really started to hit our stride with business engagement. A big symbolic victory in that respect was when we actually decided to fund grants for public-private partnerships in which both public and private money needed to be anteed up. I think that kind of opened the conversation in a very significant way.
So this is Andrea, and I would say we're really just assessing how best to engage business. I mean, certainly we've got business leadership on our state workforce board, and that membership from the business community is increasing significantly, in part due to WIOA. And much of the policies that we've been looking at and really advocating for are very much aligned with that agenda, and we continue to work closely with them. We've also been working in close partnership with the Minnesota Business Chamber and really assessing how do we build on that in a more strategic way, but certainly have been in planning conversations with them to align policy agendas. And then in Minnesota, we're fortunate to have some things in place, but I think it's just a matter of where do we go next and how do we bring that voice forward in a more meaningful way. So we have employers that are contributing to unemployment insurance. That money gets distributed to employers to support often incumbent worker training through sort of individualized partnerships that employers may have with schools through the Job Skills Partnership here in Minnesota. And so I think now we're just figuring out how do we talk about the work and the opportunities and think about solutions where we've got business at the table. And so that's really the planning mode that we're at. Right now, terms like career pathways and even industry partnerships, we find are still not widely kind of understood, both in terms of their value and what they are. And so we're really looking at kind of even just the communication strategy around that.
Andrea, we're going to stay with you now. There are a couple of questions specifically for you. And one, I'll just begin by quoting what they say, because they say that they enjoyed your long-term timeline. And their question is, were your state policy advocacy efforts planned out multiple sessions ahead of time? And could you talk more about how you build a long-term strategy?
Yes, so we were fortunate here in that we had funders who had come together around early childhood a number of years ago, and we were able to really sort of learn from that work. And so we put together a planning process where we really looked at the national landscape and used that to inform and bring funders along in a learning process that ultimately led us to some overarching, goals or strategies with over the course of the next, whatever it was, 10 years, or 8 to 10 year timeline. And then from there, giving us enough room to be flexible and responsive based on the changing political and economic landscape. And so, you'll see there's a great deal of alignment with certainly with what other states are doing, but we also want to be thoughtful about what's unique about Minnesota, and so the nuances sort of that will fall under that multi-year agenda gives us enough room to really be responsive to that.
Thank you, Andrea. A specific question for Elizabeth. The $4.5 million that Virginia redirected to workforce development education, was that WIOA funding?
Yes, and yes, it was basically, we require now a minimum percentage of local and state WIOA Title I funds go to education and training.
Thank you. Another question for Andrea around the scorecard in Minnesota. And the question is, how do you, or how does the state manage relationships with programs that may not score as well? How do you maintain those relationships, and how do you provide opportunities for them to improve?
That's a great question, and I think it's something the state was concerned about kind of going into this. And I think there is some sensitivity and understanding for looking at results, yes, across programs, but also really taking into consideration the population, the unique challenges that may be had within that program in terms of who they're serving. And so, I think we're just in the part of beginning to gather that data, but then look at how do we use that information, and might there be technical assistance or capacity building strategy? I don't know that I can say we don't know that yet, but I think we want to be very careful in terms of how we use that information. And even when we've met with legislators around, really looking at some of the early data coming out of that report card, they themselves are pretty sensitive when they're looking at it and being very careful about who the different programs are serving and what are the various lenses that they should be taking into consideration. So some of it is providing those lenses along with the data.
Thank you. A question for both Elizabeth and Andrea, and let's begin with Elizabeth, which is around the issue of undocumented individuals and their eligibility for programs. Are there particular issues where the eligibility of undocumented folks have been particularly a part of the discussion around workforce policies in your state?
Before I answer that, Brian, I'd like to return to the previous question and say that just because we initially were looking at redirecting funds with WIOA Title I does not mean that the effort's stopping there. As I said, we have 24 programs that have some kind of annual, fairly reliable funding, either federal or state, at play, and we are looking at them one after the other after the other. We had a state legislative and audit report that encouraged us to really look at spending across the system, because of course many of these fine programs were operating as discrete programs in a silo and not as a system. So that's a really big challenge, looking at spending as a system rather than programs. You have to start somewhere, but we're by no means through with that effort. Now, in terms of undocumented workers, quite frankly, that has not been a significant issue. I would have to do some research, but that has not been an issue that has been much discussed in workforce circles, and certainly there hasn't been legislative or policy action in that area.
Andrew, how about Minnesota? Has the eligibility of undocumented individuals been, for workforce programs, been an issue in Minnesota?
Not that I'm tracking. That doesn't mean that it hasn't been, but that hasn't been something that we have followed through MSP WIN. So I'd have to look into that.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to pose a question to the panelists, and I'll even provide my perspective on it as you gather your thoughts. And that is, hearing the presentations from the three of you, and having had a chance to look at some of the materials around state legislation this year, is there anything that particularly surprises you, either patterns you see in the legislation that you find particularly noteworthy, or things missing that you find particularly noteworthy? And just to begin that, to me, I was surprised actually by something that I don't see in the legislation, which is I was surprised that there wasn't legislation enacted this session to support local sector partnerships. Was some continuation of previously established programs, continued funding, but as far as new policy pieces, really didn't come across that. And what's surprising is that state support for local sector partnerships, and as well as local support, is a requirement of WIOA. So that is something that we were expecting to see and hope to see over the coming year. So is there anything that particularly struck you you as far as what you saw or didn't see in state legislation this year?
I'm happy to go first. This is Andrea in Minnesota. For us, I would say it was a challenging session, in that there was a great number of requests for direct appropriations, and so efforts like career pathways and sector partnerships, there wasn't a great deal of understanding around that, so to even embark on that conversation was challenging, and that's why earlier I mentioned, really just even looking at our communication strategy around this. Certainly the state is beginning to think about that in the context of WIOA. I think we're a year, sort of the next year we hope to see more of that and really be part of that planning. But I think that's part of why you didn't see that this session. The other piece I would say that was challenging for us that was around higher education and just some of the concerns and points of disagreement around co-requisite remediation or just other types of reform in the remediation or developmental education space. Different perspectives from an institutional standpoint versus what others, including Complete College of America and others, are saying. And so that was a bit of a point of tension as we were pursuing some of this work under the umbrella of career pathways, and you can see sort of where we landed on that.
This is Elizabeth. I'm very intrigued by your notice of the need for additional policy around local sector partnerships. Bluntly speaking, Virginia would be very interested in suggestions around local sector partnerships and how policy might help support those. I would say I'm surprised. I'm kind of looking for policy. We're looking for policy that would help to make the system ever more business-driven and business-informed. Yes, and I appreciate Brooke's divisions of the 2015 policy. And yes, we have more job-driven training policy, although much of it is linked to budget. But there still, I think, is room for policy that would make the system more business-driven. And the third thing I would cite is policy around workforce data, education and workforce data, and the sharing of data between agencies and partners, because the accountability, the ability to track training participants over time and into jobs and beyond is so very important.
And this is Brooke. I think, I would add, I did kind of identify 3 key themes that I saw, at least in some of the legislation I reviewed, and one of them was implementation of the Federal Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and then the others were around career pathways or components of career pathways, even if they weren't identified as being structured within a career pathway approach, and then job-driven training. So one of the things that I would note is that there was legislation passed around issues like adult education and tuition assistance, that although those things are critical components of a career pathways approach, that legislation did not necessarily, in all cases, identify adult education and tuition assistance initiatives that were being undertaken explicitly as part of a career pathways approach. The other thing that I noticed is that the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, as many of us know, sets a framework for requiring some new key skill strategies, including career pathways, sector partnerships, job-driven training approaches, and data and cross-program information. And as we can see from legislation this year, as well as our legislative wrap-up last year, there are several states who have taken initiative to start programming around those strategies. independently, and so I'll be curious to see next year how some of the strategies that states have invested in or started in those areas prior to WIOA get weaved into their overall workforce development strategy under the new act. And so next year will be interesting once state plans are out to see how some of the legislation that we've reviewed in prior years and the programs that have come out of that legislation are incorporated into an overall state strategy for workforce development, and then also if there's additional things that states are taking on legislatively as part of their overall WIOA strategy.
Thank you. I'm going to have, I think, probably one last question here, which is around people with disabilities. And whether in Minnesota or Virginia, if you have plans to intentionally examine and set goals to improve employment for people with disabilities, particularly given that some of the changes in WIOA around Title IV and the continued disparity in employment for people with disabilities. Is this an issue that that you at this point have any specific plans around addressing?
This is Elizabeth. I'll go ahead and start with that one because just today, Governor McAuliffe released a new executive order, I believe it's 46, about expanding employment opportunities for individuals with disabilities as part of the 25th anniversary celebration of the American with Disabilities Act, and it's very much in line with our approach to workforce development in Virginia. For instance, one of the activities is going to involve the Secretary of Commerce and Trade convening economic developers, not just the traditional workforce services providers, but the state and region's economic developers to carve out a strategy and recommendations for more effectively promoting internships, apprenticeships, and job placement for individuals with disabilities, both to companies we're trying to recruit to come to Virginia, for companies that are expanding, and for our companies that we're trying to help stay healthy. And there are a great many other initiatives, too, that are connected with that. You know, some preference in the state procurement system for employment services organizations, et cetera. But there are a number of strategies that we just announced today, including mandatory statewide training for all agencies in, you know, the individuals with disabilities, assistive technologies, career pathways, programs that exist in the state to help make those employees transition to full-time, non-subsidized employment, you know, possible and profitable for the business.
This is Andrea in Minnesota. I would just say our primary lenses at this time are really, you know, low-income adults, and then particularly people of color, in recognition of the disparities we have in this region. I think looking at it from other lenses that you're mentioning are certainly something we'll keep on our radar as we better understand sort of the unique challenges and opportunities with regards to our population focus, and we'll see where that takes us as we continue our planning per each session.
Okay, great. Just want to give a chance, an opportunity for any of our panelists, if there was anything else that you wanted to add, any thoughts that you had that you wished you'd gotten in earlier, or like to, anything else you'd like to offer before we close out?
I would just say, this is Andrea from Minnesota, I would just say thank you for this opportunity. We're still very early on in our efforts, really 2 years really working in the public policy space, and have just appreciated National Skills Coalition leadership, being able to learn from what other states are doing and to leverage that as we embark on our own work here. We hope to really continue to pursue avenues around sector partnerships and career pathways, and there's many things that can come under those umbrellas. So we look forward to continuing to learn from others.
I agree, and I cannot overstate the importance of the National Skills Coalition to Virginia's work to date, and we look forward to the considerable expertise of the coalition staff to help inform our policy for 2016 and in the future. You've been absolutely stellar in helping states to move forward agendas around skills and credentials that really matter to business, sector strategies, and career pathways, and we appreciate it.
So this is Brooke with the National Skills Coalition. I want to thank Andrea and Elizabeth for their kind words about our work, and also to thank them for taking the time today to explain in detail some of what they've been working on in their respective states. The work that we do at National Skills Coalition is informed by the real-world expertise of partners that we have on the ground. And so as somebody who has spent time reviewing a variety of legislation passed during the 2015 sessions, I really appreciate it and found it very interesting to hear more specifically about what each of you are doing in your states. So thank you.
Thank you.
Great, and I'd like to also thank the audience for participating and submitting a great bunch of questions. So with that, it brings our webinar to a close for today, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.